Hey guys, welcome to part two of my mini little exploration on poetry publishing. If you tuned in last time, I'll make sure to put a link up to our last discussion. But if you tuned in last time, I discussed the kind of big picture of why people want to publish their poetry through the traditional literary publishing approach, and what you can hope to get out of that, and kind of how to stay centered and remember who you are and what you're all about while you're doing it. In this episode, we're going to break down things much more at a kind of granular level, much more in depth in terms of the specific logistics of it. Now, there's nothing magical here, but I feel like a lot of poets probably don't lift the hood that much on the car and kind of show you the mechanics. So I'm going to try to do that and help you out a little bit. And a lot of this stuff is just from my own experience. You might have different experiences. Every poet might approach this a different way. But that being said, this is kind of how I think about it and how I try to move forward with my own writing. So I think the most important thing throughout this, and you'll hear this a lot from me here, is you got to be organized. You got to get organized. You got to know the stuff that you've written. You have to have a rough and ready idea of what you feel is the most important stuff to send out right now, what you feel really good about. Once you're organized, you kind of have compiled your poetry and organized it. You're going to research markets. You're going to find out who's publishing what out there, when their submission periods are. It would be nice to know how often they publish different writers at different stages of their career, and learn a little bit about the types of stuff they've published before. Then from there, you're going to submit some stuff, right? You're going to put together those cover letters and those typically 5 poems with that cover letter and send it out. And then you're going to wait, right? And after a certain amount of time, you'll either get an outcome or you'll query and you'll follow up, and you'll have to stay on top of those different places you've submitted to make sure they're not forgetting about you, which can't happen. So let's go through that first part, getting organized. I think this is probably the most important part, as I said earlier. You got to know your portfolio, right? So you got to take your stuff that's previously unpublished. That means unpublished anywhere. Doesn't matter whether it was a high school lit mag or whether it was a blog post or social media, whether you printed it up and circulated it at a cafe. Your next publisher is going to want first rights to it, and that means they really want it to be previously unpublished anywhere. Once you have your poems, kind of, let's say you take ideally 10 or 20 of your poems and you organize them according to what you feel rough and ready is your strength of those pieces. You want to get a second opinion. You want to get some input from other people who've been there and done that. Get a portfolio review. And you want to get it copy edited. You don't want to have spelling errors. Obviously, punctuation and that type of thing in poetry can be subjective. But an experienced copy editor who has worked in verse before would be able to help you with that. You're going to be the final arbiter of how to punctuate your poetry, obviously, but getting a second opinion never hurts. After you've gotten your stuff organized, you have those 10 or 20 poems, you're going to research your markets. Now, I'm not paid or affiliated with Duotrope in any way. But I do myself subscribe to duotrope.com, and I find it to be extremely helpful. That's because they give you a kind of statistical insight into what other people on duotrope.com have encountered when they've submitted to a certain place. So I know from Duotrope it's pretty hard to get published in the New Yorker, and it might be a little bit easier to get published at a small poetry website, and I know roughly what those statistics mean. Now we'll talk about those statistics a little bit in greater detail. You have to take those statistics with a grain of salt, but Duotrope is still pretty invaluable. It can also tell you response times. So I know if I'm going to send my poetry over to Poetry, the magazine of the Poetry Foundation, it could take 8 months or more for that to come back. And I know that because that type of information is available there, which is useful. There are other places you can find opportunities, Poets and Writers. I don't know if that's still a print magazine you could subscribe to, but they have a nice website. Your library might have a book called Poets Market or Writers Market. Poets Market is more specific and will tell you about, high-level information about major journals and outlets. It's not as in-depth or as comprehensive as Duotrope, but you do get a little bit more kind of what they think of the prestige value of a different places to send your poetry, which sometimes is interesting. Duotrope doesn't give you any of that. That being said, I think it's very important that you know your editor and you know where you're submitting. I don't care whether you're submitting to a little, web outlet that publishes a few poems every week, or whether you're submitting to the Paris Review. You should understand the mentality and psychology of your editor, and you should understand they're under a tremendous amount of time pressure. They're always in a hurry. They never have enough time to read all the submissions. And for that very reason, you should never assume a sympathetic read. You should never assume that the editor is going to be excited and thrilled to receive your poem and that they're going to look at this the way a friend, a family member, a colleague would, where they're going to take the time to read it carefully and reread it. It's my rule of thumb when I'm sending stuff out. If my first 2 lines don't work, I just assume the editor is probably going to give up. Now, I've heard from poets who find this extremely unfair. They're not even going to read my whole poem. And, I just have to be brutally honest and say, I think probably not. I mean, maybe they scan, their eyes quickly scan up and down quickly, but they're going to have a very strong feeling about whether they want to publish your poem within a few seconds. Before they go on to the next. And if the first poem is weak, that biases the second poem in your packet and the third and the fourth, etc. So it's always better to open with something very convincing. You also want to know who reads your poem at this magazine or journal. Is it going to be an editor? Is it going to be an assistant? Is it going to be an intern? Is it going to be a graduate student? And there's nothing wrong with a division of labor, right? But if it's a tiered system, that means potentially there's going to be some form of gatekeeping, right? Where someone lower down is going to feel pressure to vet and to eliminate stuff that is clearly junk, while stuff that perhaps conforms better with what they assume the editor is going to want to read makes it through. So that's just something to bear in mind. Personally, speaking only for myself, I'd prefer any opportunity to be read by the editor. And if I'm going to be read by an intern or a graduate student or what have you, I don't feel like that's the experience that I would like. Now, that's inevitable if I'm going to submit to a very large or prestigious place. And I've certainly been published under those circumstances. But it's always my preference to have a direct relationship with the editor, even if it's a smaller journal. Sometimes I feel like the quality is also a little bit, could potentially be a little bit more curated, a little bit better if they're taking the time to read everything. I can tell you for a fact, at least when last I checked, last I knew, the Atlantic, the editor read everything there. He just reads every single poem himself. And if you're going to be published at the Atlantic, it's going to be that guy who's making that decision. Now that might be terribly inefficient, and might just be just a crazy, crazy way of doing it if he has to read thousands and thousands of poems a month. But for that particular editor, there's no other way to do it because it has to be ultimately his judgment. And I respect that, right? There are a big difference between journals that are going to read your stuff blind versus reading who you are. Now, you could ask, what do I mean by blind? I mean, there's an increasing number of journals like Rattle, Third Wednesday. There's tons of journals these days that work this way, where they don't want your name anywhere on the manuscript, and in theory, that their readers or their editor is not going to know who you are, and therefore wouldn't be biased by a big, important sounding name. That sounds great in theory, but it is the poetry, right? I mean, people have distinctive sounding poems, and you could possibly be recognized if you had a prior relationship with a reader or an editor. They might be able to pick your stuff out anyway. It's a small, cozy world. Certainly at the top, that's true. And even I'm not a pro, but there's certain poets who I would likely be able to pick out of a pile and be like, hey, wait a minute, isn't that Louise Glick? I mean, I think I recognize that style. I don't have that problem. I'm not a poetry editor, but that's something you definitely have to keep in mind, right? I feel like there are other issues with the blind process. And not to say that I don't think the blind process has some big advantages, and I've been published through blind process before, so I think it can be really, really good. But I feel like if you're an underrepresented writer, if you're a minority writer, or you just feel like you're deeply you haven't been given the same consideration that the writers from other backgrounds have been given. Well, you don't have an opportunity to connect that to anybody in your cover letter. You can't say, I feel like people like me have been historically underrepresented, and I want you to read my poem in light of the historic injustice, right? So there's no way to do that if you're reading blind. And that's been pointed out as a flaw. Blind could end up kind of recapitulating and reinforcing existing prejudices and systemic biases, where we unconsciously end up preferring the work of straight, white, male writers, which probably isn't the best way forward. Then again, not trying to control for our biases, and not trying to work through and experiment with these different formats, I think blind does have something to offer. And I think also it's good to have different approaches, and to have a kind of laboratory out there where different journals can take different use different methods. I will also say if you're looking at really, really big journals, really established journals, you're submitting to really, truly elite top-tier places. Let's say you're sending some stuff over to the Paris Review. Well, if you open the Paris Review, you're going to find a lot of the poets published there have won Pulitzer prizes. They've won Guggenheim fellowships. They've been poet laureates of the United States. Just incredibly strong credentials. They're professors at incredibly influential institutions. And as it turns out, that's by design. Paris Review will solicit manuscripts from important writers. They'll just say, hey, we would like to get some more of your stuff. Send it our way. While people like myself, I don't have that type of reputation, right? So if I want to submit to the Paris Review, I'm going through a different channel. I'm going through what's called unsolicited manuscripts, or slush. So I have to wait a longer period of time. And in some cases, a lot of journals are starting to charge money for these unsolicited submissions. And that starts to feel a little borderline to me, right? It's a little kind of, I don't know, right? So like, you kind of have the two classes of writer now. You have this elites who are solicited directly, and then the rest of us are kind of paying a fee or a tax, I guess. But in essence, we could be underwriting or helping pay for more established writers. I'm happy to support the career of writers and poets I admire. I have no problem with that. I'd prefer to do that through buying their book or buying a copy of the journal. This I start to feel is a little bit penalizing naive or newer, younger writers to redistribute their wealth or their monies to more experienced or more established writers, and that seems to me kind of uncomfortably mirrors some economic situations that we have in this country that I'm not super comfortable with. So I would definitely recommend to you avoid paying submission fees. If a place is charging you a $3 fee, what they're essentially saying is, we're just not that interested in you, right? We would prefer that we would like to publish our friends. Now, I'm not saying that's always true, right? And I'm saying if you've studied a journal, you might be able to know that better and feel things out. But in general, I would say, especially when you're starting out and trying to break through, right, you're going to spend $3 a pop on these submissions, and pretty soon you spend $30, and then it's $50, and maybe you could have gone out with a friend and had a nice dinner or a bottle of wine, or taken a little train trip or something like that, or just done something for yourself. Buy yourself some fancy journals with leather covers or something, or some nice books. I don't know, something to kind of open your space up a little bit, right? Instead of buying bitterness, right? Bitterness isn't going to help you, and it's always a struggle. It's always a struggle to avoid that bitter feeling of rejection hurts enough without having paid $3 for it. Trust me. So another thing you can look out for when you're submitting is, well, what am I going to get if they publish me? Now, with a web place, web journal, I think it's fine if they're going to retweet you or hit you up on socials and stuff like that. That's probably what they can afford, and that's copacetic. But if you're going to be published in print, I think they ought to send you a complimentary copy, what's called a contributor's copy of the journal. And if they're not willing to do that, you get into this kind of weird vanity space, right, where they're saying, okay, well, we're going to publish you, but we can't afford to send you a copy, therefore you're going to have to pay for it. Well, that just sounds a little bit sketch, right? So I would check that out first. So again, you're not in a situation where they're like, we want to publish your work, but there's this caveat, right? It's always best to know that on your way in, right? So we talked a little bit last time about what makes a journal reputable, but the best way for you to do that is for you to decide for yourself, would I feel good being published here? Now, I've been published at places where after receiving a copy or reading the stuff there, I was like, well, I don't think all the writing I'm appearing next to is that good. And if I had a choice, I'd always prefer to be feeling like, well, my poetry might not be the strongest poetry in this journal. That's a better feeling than, well, I might be the best poet in this journal. Now, that's a very personal, idiosyncratic perspective that I have. But you always got to say, when you're sending stuff out, there is a risk that they publish you, and that could be the worst punishment of all. Now, I know for all of you who've never published, you might be thinking, oh, he's crazy. I'll be published anywhere. I don't care. But you say that now, right? So, I got to tell you about this crazy thing in the world of poetry called simultaneous submissions, which is totally bad shit. Excuse me. Bad crap. Bad. Not like Batman at all. Batman wouldn't put up with this. This is a crazy thing, but it can sort of work to your advantage. Simultaneous submissions is like what you would normally think would be your right to do as a writer, which is like you send some poems to this journal and you send your poems to the other journal. And you could send the same poem to different journals at the same time. They don't need to know and they don't need to care. It's not their problem. But some journals actually really get kind of mad if you do that. And that they would say they have this policy, no simultaneous submissions, meaning if we're considering it, we're so important and so special that if we're considering your poem, we don't want you to send it anywhere else while we're considering it. Now, there's fewer of these journals than there used to be, but there still are those. And here's what's weird. I've had pretty good luck with this type of journal, which has this policy. And I actually think it works well with a small editorial staff that's going to take your stuff seriously and doesn't want to be overwhelmed with submissions and doesn't want to deal with all this nonsense where if they agree to publish you, then you're like, oh, well, actually, I'm still waiting, or, someone else has said they're going to publish it. And it's easier for them to have this simple process where send us your work, give us a couple months, and we'll get back to you. Now, the problem is if then you send them your work and they sit on it, it gets super, super frustrating. But there aren't as many of these opportunities as there used to be. And more journals are saying it's fine, you can send us simultaneous submissions. Now, the other upside, if you avoid simultaneous, if you send out your 5 poems to one zine and then a different 5 poems to another, so you end up not doing simultaneous, is if the first place takes a poem, you have no conflict, right? You have nothing to write or withdraw or, apologize for or anything. You're totally fine. And if you start sending out tons and tons of poems left and right, and you're kind of spamming, you're just machine gunning these submissions out there, eventually, sooner or later, right, someone's going to pick up a piece and then you have to withdraw it from the other places. And if you don't do that and you don't withdraw it from those other places, then, you can kind of put yourself in a kind of an awkward situation where you get published at 2 places at once, but technically they're both asking for first rights. So you shouldn't do that. Now, I'm sure there's been poets who have done that anyway, but it's unscrupulous. And if people found out about it, it would look really, really bad. So my recommendation to you is if you're going to send out stuff simultaneous, keep good records. Going back to the stay organized thing, use a database or a spreadsheet and keep very careful records of exactly when you sent what, so that you can withdraw stuff if it's accepted at one place. So as I indicated before, right, you fire your stuff off, you're super excited, you're like, Max, you're full of such great ideas, I'm going to send my stuff out, and then nothing happens, right? Like a month goes by, nothing happens. Another month goes by, nothing happens. Another month, still nothing happens. And that's incredibly frustrating and typical, where it's really hard to get back. There are exceptions, but in general, you're going to be waiting at least 3 months, probably 6 months, maybe even longer in many, many, many cases. And you have to look at their guidelines. If their guidelines are, hey, after 3 months you can query, then you really do need to query after 3 months to find out what happened. You have to be polite and professional and be like, dear editors, I submitted my stuff via USPS or via your submittable system 3 months ago, and I haven't heard. If you're still considering my work, I totally understand. That's awesome. But if you've made a decision and haven't had the opportunity to circle back, et cetera, you got to do that. You got to be very, very nice. I totally understand if you're still considering type of thing, right? Especially in these crazy COVID days. It behooves you to be professional. I've had situations where I've been nice, I've queried, and been very as kind as I possibly could. Very nice. And the editor says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we lost your your envelope or whatever. Send us the stuff electronically. We'll give it another look, and that's great because again, returning to my earlier theme, if you're connecting directly with an editor who can make a decision, it's always better than being stuck in a limbo where you don't really know who's reading it. If it's like somebody's boyfriend who's reading your submission, just like, oh, I hate this stuff. That's not so good. That's not ideal, right? All right. Not that boyfriends are bad. Boyfriends are great. They're great. But, if they don't like poetry, well, maybe that's even better. Huh. All right. Let's go on to these non-responding journals. This happens all the time. Journals fold all the time. So you just got to mark that stuff in your database or your spreadsheet as lost and move on with life. You just can't. Life's too short, right? I do have situations where if I know the journal, I'll wait over a year. But that gets to be pretty painful, right? I don't care how prestigious that journal is. After a year, it starts to be like, ugh. All right. So let's say things go great for you, and I really hope that they do. I think you're going to do just amazing. There are weird things that can happen. You got to understand the terms. If they're offering you payment, they'll typically insist that you come to some type of terms with them. You have to agree, to release your rights for that piece or for those pieces in order for them to contractually pay you. Now, if they're not paying you, I've seen this a lot. It kind of bothers me. But they won't even ask. They'll be like, okay, well, we're publishing it. Have a nice day. I would much prefer a situation where they offer me galleys, which is proofs, so I can see how it's going to look in print. That would be really, really great. But, it's a fast-paced world out there, especially for journals that aren't going to pay you anyway. Sometimes they'll just be like, we're moving forward. We're going to publish your piece. Have a nice day. And again, that's key. If you're sending out stuff simultaneous, you got to make sure you withdraw. And as soon as you hear about an acceptance, you got to write those withdrawal letters. So those withdrawal letters can help you. If you write a nice professional withdrawal letter, it's a great opportunity to be considered here. Unfortunately, the piece, a poem about sunsets, was accepted at Journal XYZ, and I must withdraw it at this time. That can make you look good too, right? Of course, if it was published at like Podunk, Nowhereville, maybe you just say it was accepted somewhere else. So that could be another little finesse you could do. But some editors just don't care, some do. Important point here is when you give a journal those first rights. Typically at the time, if they're paying you, which is not every journal would do that, but if they are paying you, you lose the right to your poem until it goes to press. So you can't put it on your social media. You can't, post it on your blog. You can't do those things with it. You can't submit it to another journal that prints that accepts reprints, because the rights aren't yours until it goes to press. And as soon as it's in print, then those rights revert. That's almost always how it works, and it's yours again. The moment the rights revert, you can do whatever you want with it again, and you can put it on your Insta. But you got to hold off on that until it goes to press. So I think we covered a pretty good meaty amount here. We didn't cover the cover letter, so maybe that's something that I should discuss really quickly, or maybe that's something I should break into another episode. But I'll just touch on it real quick here. How about that? I'll touch on it, and then we'll do another whole episode on it, because I think people make too much of it. Right? I think in most cases, most of the time, your cover letter doesn't really matter that much. again, if you were Louise Glick, if you had won the Nobel Prize, I do think that your cover letter probably matters and probably makes a pretty big difference. And if you've published extensively and you're submitting your stuff to a relatively small, publishes mostly lesser known or emerging stuff, maybe that could make a difference. Like if you're a professor of creative writing somewhere, that might be something you would know. But if you're listening to my channel, you're probably in a situation where you haven't published that much stuff. And you're like, well, oh my God, what do I put in my cover letter? What do I do? What do I do? And if you're really, really anxious about it and it really eats you up, like, well, I'm a nobody, so like they're never going to do anything with my poetry. They'll just always reject it. And well, first of all, it's just not true. We all started there, right? So my cover letter was, my name is Max, and I'm really excited about these pieces and feel they're my best output to date, and I'm honored that you're considering them, and that's about it. That's really all I said. And I think that's the less you say, the better. In general, if your cover letter is, it's my privilege to submit to the Georgia Review. Included are my 5 best pieces to date. They are published nowhere else, and I look forward to whatever you have to say about them. And then you could just say, I received my BA from whatever, or whatever degree you have. And if you had a relationship where you studied with a certain poet, there I studied with poet blah blah blah, or I took English classes with Professor Snooten Fluken, whatever. Maybe you say that, maybe you don't. And just be like, don't say anything more. And just, that's it. End of story. Thanks again, or yours truly, or whatever. Done. And a cover letter. But if this eats you up, right, it's just causing you grief. Like, oh my gosh, I'm not wearing any clothing. How do I go out to dinner when I'm just buck, right? And like, I'm not wearing clothing because everyone's going to see me naked, right? Well, and you could submit to these blind places if that really bothers you that much. And I don't really think it's that much of a difference between the blind process and the non-blind process. It's almost all of this is just how selective these journals are. It's the ones that receive 1,000 submissions a week, they can't publish that much of your stuff. And the ones that receive, 100 submissions for their entire period, well, it's probably going to be easier for them to publish your stuff. And that's not to say like you should just publish at the, submit your stuff to the place with the lowest standards. That's not at all what I'm saying. Sometimes if you go to a library or bookstore or whatever, or a website, and you go for a really prestigious, like crazy prestigious journal, and you pull it out and you open it and start reading it, you might be like, this is just garbage. This is just not at all what I'm into. And I don't write like this. I don't want to write like this. I don't respect this. This isn't my thing at all. Right? So you could just find you're just not feeling it. And I've had that too. Like I've pulled out a journal and been like, oh my gosh, what are they thinking publishing this crap? This just isn't good. And it's really, really prestigious journal. And sometimes I've pulled out a very small, out of the way podunk place journal, and I've found it to be pretty consistently high quality stuff. Maybe it's not like amazing, but it's like there's definitely instances where I would prefer the jazz club that's a hole in the wall in on a Wednesday night, where there's just dudes jamming and having a good time, than like paying the big sticker price to go into, this really stuck up and pretentious and, just stiff, boring standards, So everybody has their own taste, right? And sometimes the most interesting stuff is found out of the way. Now you could take that too far, right? But I think you should submit your stuff to places where you admire, and if that's hard to get into, and that's a selective journal, then send it anyway. Don't let anyone tell you not to. All right, so I will break out another episode on La Cover Letter, and we'll get into that a little bit more in our next episode. And again, if you have questions, if there's things where you're like, well, I'm just, I'm on the fence about this. I kind of want to send some stuff out, but I don't know. Should I send out, this poem or that one? What do you think? Just weigh in on the comments, and let me know where you're at in the process. I think everybody can get better quicker by taking some risks, and by putting themselves out there. By exposing yourself a little bit, becoming more radically vulnerable, I do think it will allow you to improve your writing more quickly. So, right on. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk again soon.